June 15th. 1944. 0830 hours. The turquoise waters off the western coast of Saipan churn into a white froth as hundreds of armored tractors claw their way toward the reef. Inside the steel belly of an LVT Amtrak, Private First Class Michael Rossi grips his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles turn the color of bone. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fumes and nervous sweat, a suffocating cocktail that makes breathing difficult in the humid tropical heat. Overhead, the sky rips apart as naval shells form a rolling curtain of fire, hammering the green shoreline into a grey wasteland of pulverized coral and smoke. As the treads of the amphibious vehicle bite into the sand of Beach Red 2, the ramp drops with a heavy metallic clang that signals the beginning of hell. Rossi and his squad surge forward into chaos, their boots sinking into the soft volcanic sand while mortar rounds detonate with earth-shattering force all around them. The pristine beach has transformed into a slaughterhouse where the screams of wounded men compete with the staccato rhythm of Japanese Nambu machine guns hidden in the tree line. Every step forward is a gamble against death, and the realization hits every man that the bombardment has failed to silence the dug-in defenders. High above the chaotic shoreline, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito watches the invasion unfold from his command post deep within the limestone ridges. He knows that the fate of the empire rests on these 15 miles of rock and jungle because Saipan is the key to the inner defense perimeter. His strategy relies on a defense in depth, utilizing the island's natural caves and ravines to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground they attempt to take. Saito has positioned his artillery batteries with deadly precision, registering every yard of the landing beaches to ensure that the invading Marines face a wall of steel and fire the moment they step onto the sand. By mid-morning, the momentum of the assault threatens to stall as the Marines find themselves pinned down behind low sand dunes and shattered palm logs. The initial plan to race inland has evaporated under the withering fire that pours from concealed bunkers and spider holes that seem to be everywhere at once. Commanders scream orders over the roar of explosions, trying to organize fire teams to suppress the enemy positions that command the high ground overlooking the beachhead. The carnage is absolute, with burning Amtraks littering the reef and medical corpsmen dashing frantically between craters to apply tourniquets to limbs that have been shredded by jagged shrapnel. As darkness begins to fall on that first bloody day, the tactical situation remains precarious for the 20,000 Americans clinging to the narrow strip of coast. The night brings a different kind of terror, where shadows move and the sounds of the jungle amplify the paranoia of men who have seen too much death in too few hours. They dig foxholes in the loose soil, knowing that the Japanese doctrine favors night attacks designed to break the morale of the weary invaders. Every snapping twig or rustling palm frond triggers a spasm of gunfire, as exhausted Marines fire at phantoms in the dark, desperate to survive until the sun rises again. The anticipated Japanese counterattack materializes in the pre-dawn hours of June 16th with a ferocity that shakes the ground. Tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment rumble out of the darkness, their commanders standing exposed in the turrets, with swords drawn in a display of ancient martial spirit. They crash into the lines of the 6th Marines, sparking a confused melee, where bazooka teams fire at point-blank range, and star shells illuminate the macabre scene in flickering bursts of light. The clash of steel and explosives is deafening, a desperate struggle where the technological might of the American war machine meets the unyielding spirit of the Imperial Japanese Army head-on. When the smoke clears the following morning, the beachhead is littered with the smoking hulks of Japanese Type 97 tanks and the bodies of hundreds of infantrymen. The failure of this armored thrust marks a turning point, forcing General Saito to abandon the coast and retreat into the rugged interior of the island. For the Americans, the successful repulse of the counterattack secures their foothold, but the victory comes with the grim understanding that the hardest fighting still lies ahead. The easy ground has been taken, but the looming silhouette of Mount Tapashau in the distance promises a campaign of vertical warfare against an enemy who prefers death to surrender. Over the next several days, the invasion force swells as the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division comes ashore to reinforce the battered Marine divisions. The logistical feat is staggering, with tons of supplies, ammunition, and heavy artillery pouring onto the beaches to feed the insatiable appetite of the offensive. Engineers work feverishly under sporadic sniper fire to bulldoze roads and clear debris, transforming the chaotic landing zones into functioning staging areas. The air is thick with the dust of moving vehicles and the stench of decay, a sensory assault that serves as a constant reminder of the high cost of this amphibious operation. The advance inland begins in earnest, a slow and methodical grinding operation that sees American forces pushing through sugarcane fields and dense brush. The Japanese defenders make them pay for every yard, utilizing masterful camouflage to ambush patrols and disrupt supply lines. It is a war of small units, where corporals and sergeants make life-or-death decisions in the blink of an eye, often cut off from higher command by the terrain and the fog of war. The lush tropical landscape, which looks so beautiful from the air, hides 1,000 death traps tailored to maim and kill the advancing troops. A primary objective for the invasion force is a Sleeto airfield on the southern end of the island, a prize that will allow American land-based aircraft to operate. The battle for the airfield is intense, with Japanese defenders fighting from hangars and revetments until they are blasted out by flamethrowers and demolition charges. Capturing this facility is critical not just for the battle on Saipan, but for the broader strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The sight of the first American planes landing on the captured runway boosts morale, symbolizing that the island is slowly but surely changing hands. Unlike previous island-hopping campaigns, the Americans on Saipan encounter a significant population of Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire. Fearful families hide in the same caves used by the military, terrified by propaganda that paints the Americans as brutal monsters who will torture and kill them. Soldiers often hold their fire upon hearing the cries of children, creating a hesitation that Japanese snipers ruthlessly exploit. This intermingling of combatants and non-combatants adds a horrific layer of complexity to the battle, forcing young Americans to distinguish between enemy soldiers and terrified refugees in split-second encounters. While the infantry slogs through the mud, a massive naval engagement unfolds in the waters west of the Marianas, directly impacting the fate of the men on the ground. The Battle of the Philippine Sea sees the U.S. Navy decimate Japanese carrier air power in an event the pilots call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The destruction of hundreds of Japanese planes means that General Saito can expect no air support and no reinforcements from the mainland. The garrison on Saipan is effectively cut off, isolated thousands of miles from home with their backs against the sea and an overwhelming force pressing in. Deep in his command bunker, General Saito receives the crushing news of the naval defeat and realizes that his forces are truly alone. The grand strategy of the Empire has failed to stop the American juggernaut at the water's edge, and now he must transition to a war of attrition designed to inflict maximum casualties. He issues orders to withdraw to the high ground of central Saipan, preparing a defensive line that utilizes the jagged terrain of Mount Tapasho. There will be no evacuation and no surrender. Only a fight to the death intended to delay the inevitable advance on Tokyo for as long as possible. Back on the front lines, the physical toll on the American troops is becoming evident as the days blur into a continuous cycle of violence and heat exhaustion. Water is scarce and often tastes of oil or chlorine, providing little relief from the tropical sun that beats down mercilessly on helmets and heavy packs. Combat fatigue sets in, characterized by the 1,000-yard stare seen in the eyes of men who have witnessed their friends blown apart by mortar rounds. Yet they keep moving forward, driven by a mixture of discipline, camaraderie, and the grim knowledge that the only way home lies through the Japanese lines. By the end of June, the battle lines have shifted from the beaches to the foothills of the central mountain range. The easy phase, if it could ever be called that, is over, and the Americans stare up at the forbidding slopes of Mount Tapasho. The jagged peaks loom like fortress towers, hiding thousands of desperate men who have had time to prepare their kill zones. As the Marines and soldiers check their weapons and prepare for the ascent, they are about to leave the flat coastal plains behind and enter a topographical nightmare that will come to be known as the Green Hell. As the calendar turns to late June, the battle shifts from the suffocating heat of the coastal cane fields to the jagged, unforgiving spine of the island. Mount Tapasho dominates the landscape, rising 1,500 feet into the clouds like a prehistoric fortress guarding the heart of Saipan. For the men of the 27th Infantry Division and the Marine units flanking them, The ascent is a vertical nightmare through tangled undergrowth and razor-sharp coral pinnacles. Every step upward is a struggle against gravity and an unseen enemy who watches their every move from concealed observation posts high above, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The American advance funnels into a terrifying natural amphitheater that the troops grimly christen Death Valley. It is a lowland corridor flanked by steep cliffs, turning the attacking battalions into fish in a barrel for Japanese gunners positioned on the ridges. Artillery shells rain down with terrifying accuracy, their explosions magnified by the echoing canyon walls until the noise becomes a physical blow to the chest. Men scramble for cover behind jagged rocks, but the plunging fire from the heights finds them in even the deepest crevices, turning the valley floor into a chaotic mosaic of smoke, pulverized stone, and blood. To the east of this killing zone lies a formidable escarpment that quickly earns the moniker Purple Heart Ridge due to the staggering number of casualties sustained there. The Japanese have honeycombed the cliff face with fighting positions, rendering them nearly invisible until the muzzle flashes appear. US soldiers must claw their way up near vertical slopes, while grenades roll down upon them like deadly hail from the defenders above. The fighting here is intimate and savage, often reduced to hand-to-hand struggles, where entrenching tools and bayonets replace jammed rifles in the mud and gore of the steep inclines. General Saito has utilized the geology of the mountain to create a defensive masterpiece that negates the American advantage in firepower. His troops occupy a vast network of natural and man-made caves that are connected by deep tunnels, allowing them to appear, fire, and vanish before return fire can be brought to bear. These positions are often sited on reverse slopes, protecting them from the devastating naval bombardment that continues to pound the forward face of the mountain. The defenders wait patiently in the dark, damp bowels of the earth, subsisting on dwindling rations while holding the line with fanatical determination to root out an enemy that refuses to surface. The Marines and GIs develop a brutal method known as the blowtorch and corkscrew tactic. Flamethrower operators, burdened by heavy tanks of napalm, risk their lives to sprint across open ground and spray liquid fire into the cave mouths. Once the searing heat drives the defenders back or consumes them, combat engineers rush forward to hurl satchel charges of high explosives into the opening. The resulting concussions collapse the entrances, sealing the Japanese soldiers inside their stone tombs forever. Silencing the guns one position at a time, the physical environment of the Central Highlands proves to be just as lethal as the Japanese bullets. The humidity is oppressive, soaring to levels that turn uniforms into heavy, sweat-soaked rags that cling to chafed skin. Water supplies are critically low as logistics units struggle to manhandle jerrycans up the treacherous trails under constant sniper fire. Heat exhaustion claims almost as many men as enemy fire, with soldiers collapsing in the brush, their bodies pushed beyond the breaking point by days of continuous climbing and fighting without sleep or proper nourishment. The slow progress through this torturous terrain ignites a firestorm of controversy within the American High Command. Marine General Holland Smith, frustrated by the lack of speed on his right flank, relieves Army Major General Ralph Smith of his command in a move that shocks the officer corps. This inter-service conflict highlights the immense pressure to secure the island quickly. But for the grunts on the ground, the politics of generals mean nothing. Their reality is the soldier next to them and the terrified anticipation of the next mortar round whistling in from the unseen heights. As night falls over the ridges, the battlefield transforms into a realm of paranoia where sleep is impossible. Japanese infiltrators, wrapped in foliage and moving with ghostly silence, slip through the porous American lines to slit throats and sabotage equipment. Trip flares pop and hiss, casting eerie dancing shadows that look like charging enemies to sleep-deprived sentries. The darkness is filled with the sounds of foreign voices and the clinking of metal, keeping every man's finger resting on the trigger, waiting for the scream of a Banzai charge that could come from any direction. Within the labyrinth of caves on Mount Tapasho, the tragedy of the civilian population deepens in the darkness. Hundreds of terrified families share the damp, claustrophobic spaces with the desperate soldiers, often used as human shields or forced to commit suicide rather than surrender. American interpreters use loudspeakers to plead with them to come out, promising food and safety. But their voices echo off the canyon walls largely unanswered. When civilians do emerge, They are often emaciated and shell-shocked, walking like ghosts out of the mountainside. Caught in a hell not of their making, American Sherman tanks struggle to provide support in the broken terrain, where tracks slip on loose shale and ravines block their path. When they do manage to maneuver into firing positions, they become magnets for Japanese anti-tank guns hidden in the heavy foliage. Infantrymen huddle behind the steel beasts for protection, using the tanks as mobile pillboxes to inch forward against the entrenched enemy. The roar of the tank engines and the crack of their 75mm cannons provide a psychological boost, a noisy reminder of American industrial might in a primitive, savage wilderness. The battle for the summit of Mount Taposhao becomes a grueling contest of will that lasts for days. A battalion from the 2nd Marine Division finally claws its way to the peak, bypassing heavy pockets of resistance to plant the stars and stripes on the highest point of the island. From this vantage point, the exhausted conquerors can finally see the entire island laid out below them, from the invasion beaches to the northern cliffs. However, possessing the summit does not mean controlling the mountain, as thousands of Japanese remain fighting in the caves beneath their boots. For the Japanese defenders, the loss of the high ground signals the beginning of the end. Yet their resolve does not waver. Cut off from their commanders and running low on ammunition, isolated squads continue to fight with suicidal bravery. They scavenge American weapons and rations from the dead, determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. The concept of surrender is alien to their indoctrination, and the shame of capture is considered a fate far worse than death, driving them to hold out in their holes until they are blasted into oblivion. Evacuating the wounded from the jagged slopes of the mountain is a logistical nightmare that requires heroic efforts from the medical corps. Stretcher bearers must navigate slippery, steep trails while under fire, sometimes taking hours to move a single casualty, a few hundred yards to a jeep ambulance. The screams of men in pain pierce the humid air, driving their comrades to fight harder to clear the path. Every soldier knows that a serious wound in this terrain is a grave threat, not just from the injury itself, but from the agonizing delay in reaching surgical help. As June bleeds into July, the American steamroller finally grinds its way past the central mountains, pushing the remnants of Saito's army toward the northern end of Saipan. The terrain begins to flatten out slightly, but the compression of the enemy forces means the fighting remains intense. The Japanese are now backed into a corner, with nowhere left to retreat but the sea. The victory at Mount Taposhao is significant, but it has only compressed the spring of Japanese resistance, winding it tighter for a final, catastrophic release of energy. The battlefield is now a landscape of ruin, littered with the detritus of 2 weeks of relentless combat. American troops, gaunt and hollow-eyed, take brief moments to rest while their commanders plan the final drive to the north. Behind the enemy lines, the situation is desperate. There is no food, medical supplies are non-existent, and the wounded are suffering entirely without relief. The stage is being set for a horrific conclusion, as the Japanese command realizes that traditional tactics have failed, leaving them with only one final, bloody option to express their devotion to the emperor. By the first week of July, the tactical map of Saipan resembles a deadly funnel, with the broad base of the American advance squeezing the remnants of the Japanese garrison into the narrowing peninsula of the north. The verdant jungles and cane fields that characterized the earlier fighting give way to a jagged, rocky plateau that offers little natural cover from the relentless aerial and naval bombardment. The Americans have established a line of steel across the width of the island, a coordinated wall of tanks and infantry that moves inexorably forward, crushing everything in its path. For the defenders, space is running out, and with every square mile lost, the density of the target area increases, allowing U.S. artillery to concentrate its fire with devastating efficiency. The retreat to the north is not a tactical withdrawal but a trail of absolute misery carved into the volcanic rock and coral dust. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, stripped of their heavy weapons and vehicles, stumble along narrow footpaths that are choked with the debris of a defeated army. Uniforms are reduced to tattered rags, encrusted with blood and mud, hanging loosely on frames that have been hollowed out by weeks of malnutrition. Discipline, once the iron backbone of the Imperial Army, begins to fray at the edges as units become intermixed and officers lose contact with their subordinates in the confusion of the exodus. They move primarily at night to avoid the prowling American aircraft, a ghostly procession of shadowed figures marching toward their own graves. Hunger becomes a foe more immediate and agonizing than the American Marines, gnawing at the bellies of men who have not seen a proper ration in days. The masterful logistical system of the Japanese army has utterly collapsed, leaving soldiers to scavenge for survival in a landscape blasted barren by war. Men resort to eating raw snails, tree roots, and even the leather of their own equipment in a desperate bid to stave off the weakness that threatens to collapse them. The lack of fresh water is even more critical, driving soldiers to drink from stagnant, fly-infested puddles, or risk death by creeping to exposed streams under the gaze of American snipers. This physical degradation turns fierce warriors into walking skeletons, yet they continue to drag their rifles north, driven by an indoctrination that forbids stopping. General Yoshitsugu Saito relocates his command post to a cramped cave near the northern village of Makunsha, a dark and damp hole in the ground that befits the grim situation. The aging commander, once a figure of immaculate authority, has deteriorated physically along with his army, appearing haggard and frail in the flickering light of oil lamps. His communications network is shattered, relying on runners who often never return to deliver messages to units that may no longer exist. In this subterranean bunker, the air is thick with stale cigarette smoke and the heavy silence of defeat, as staff officers move maps with shaking hands, marking the inexorable shrinking of their perimeter. Saito knows that no reinforcements are coming, yet he continues to issue orders for a defense that has become a mathematical impossibility. The most horrific scenes of the retreat unfold within the makeshift field hospitals that have been established in the deep limestone caves of the northern cliffs. Without anesthesia, antibiotics, or bandages, the medical staff can offer little more than prayers to the hundreds of wounded men who crowd the dark recesses. The stench of gangrene and necrotic flesh is overpowering, a miasma that assaults the senses long before one enters the cavern mouth. Maggots infest open wounds, and the screams of men undergoing amputation with unsterilized sores echo off the stone walls, a chorus of agony that haunts the survivors. Surgeons work until they collapse from exhaustion, their aprons stiff with dried blood, engaged in a futile struggle to save lives that are already forfeit. As the American noose tightens, the Japanese command is forced to make a utilitarian and brutal decision regarding the immobile wounded who cannot be moved further north. To prevent them from falling into enemy hands, a fate considered the ultimate dishonor, medical officers and comrades administer the final mercy. Grenades are distributed to those who can pull the pin themselves, while others are given lethal injections or dispatched with a pistol shot to the head. This grim culling of their own ranks is performed with a somber efficiency, a tragic necessity in the twisted logic of a no-surrender war. The caves are then sealed or abandoned, becoming mass tombs filled with the bodies of men who were sacrificed to maintain the mobility of the retreating force. Meanwhile, the American pressure is relentless, a combined arms juggernaut that allows the enemy no time to regroup or dig new defensive lines. The U.S. Navy parks its battleships and destroyers just offshore, delivering direct fire support that obliterates Japanese strongpoints with terrifying accuracy. Spotter planes circle lazily overhead like vultures, radioing coordinates to the gunnery officers who rain high-explosive shells onto any sign of movement. The psychological impact of this constant bombardment is shattering, denying the Japanese soldiers sleep and keeping them in a perpetual state of adrenaline-fueled terror. The earth itself seems to convulse under the barrage, turning the northern plateau into a moonscape of craters and shattered limestone. The coordination between the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division and the Marine divisions on the flanks has improved, closing the gaps that the Japanese had previously exploited. They move with methodical caution, using flamethrower tanks to burn out the brush and sealing caves with bulldozers as they advance. This is a war of extermination, where the objective is not to capture terrain, but to neutralize the enemy force completely. Infantry patrols scour the ravines and thickets, engaging in sudden, violent firefights with Japanese stragglers who fight with the ferocity of trapped animals. There is no front line in the traditional sense, only a zone of death where danger can erupt from behind any rock or tree. The ruins of Garapan, once the bustling administrative capital of the Marianas, lie shattered in the wake of the American advance, a testament to the destructive power of modern warfare. The Japanese look back at the smoking skeleton of the city and see the physical destruction of their colonial ambitions. Fighting in the rubble has been savage, a house-to-house struggle that has further depleted the dwindling strength of the garrison. Now, pushed beyond the city limits, they are herded into the wilder, less developed northern tip of the island. The loss of the port and the airfield means that the Japanese are now fighting solely for time, hoping to bleed the Americans enough to delay the invasion of the next island in the chain. Intermingled with the retreating military columns are thousands of terrified civilians, creating a chaotic humanitarian disaster that complicates the tactical situation. Women, children, and the elderly trudge along the dusty paths, carrying their meager possessions on their backs, their faces masks of exhaustion and fear. They have been told by the military that the Americans are barbarians who will rape and torture them, a lie that drives them to flee toward the cliffs of Marpy Point rather than surrender. The crying of infants and the sobbing of mothers mix with the sounds of battle, creating a surreal and heartbreaking soundscape. Soldiers occasionally share their last grains of rice with the civilians, but more often, they urge them onward to a doom that awaits at the edge of the sea. As the retreating forces congregate in the north, the Japanese inventory of weapons reaches a critical nadir. Artillery batteries have been overrun or destroyed, and mortar crews have fired their last rounds, leaving them with useless tubes of metal. To compensate for the lack of modern weaponry, soldiers and able-bodied civilians begin to fashion crude spears from bamboo poles, sharpening the tips and hardening them over fires. Bayonets are lashed to sticks, and stones are gathered in piles to be used as missiles. It is a regression to primitive warfare, a desperate attempt to arm a force that has nothing left but its spirit and its willingness to die. This transition from a modern army to a spear-wielding mob signals the final descent into the abyss. The psychological state of the Japanese forces fractures into two distinct camps, those who have succumbed to total despair and those who have embraced the ecstasy of impending death. Some soldiers, broken by the incessant shelling and the horror of their situation, wander aimlessly in a daze, waiting for a bullet to end their suffering. Others, particularly the officers and the die-hard veterans, channel their fear into a fanatical resolve to execute one last glorious strike against the enemy. They polish their swords and write farewell haikus, preparing their souls for the journey to the Yasukuni shrine. The atmosphere in the northern encampments is electric with this death cult mentality, a collective hysteria that overrides the instinct for self-preservation. By July 6th, the remnants of the Japanese garrison are compressed into an area of less than a few square miles on the Tanapag Plain and the adjacent high ground. The American 105th Infantry Regiment has moved into position along the perimeter, digging in for the night, unaware that they are sitting directly in the path of the coming storm. The silence that settles over the battlefield is deceptive, a heavy, suffocating calm that masks the frenzied preparations taking place in the darkness beyond. The noose has tightened completely, leaving no room for maneuver, no avenue for escape, and no option but to lash out with everything that remains. General Saito, sitting in his cave, realizes that the moment of final decision has arrived. He is a man burdened by the weight of total failure, knowing that he has lost the Emperor's Island and thousands of his men. The shame burns hotter than the tropical sun, and he knows that he cannot survive the coming dawn. He summons his remaining commanders, men who are bandaged, dirty, and starving, to a final council of war. There is no discussion of tactics or strategy in the traditional sense, for those concepts no longer apply. There is only the discussion of how to die well, how to inflict one last wound upon the enemy, and how to lead their men into the afterlife with honor. The orders go out via runners to every nook and cranny of the northern stronghold. Gather every man who can walk, every man who can hold a weapon, and even those who can only hobble. The sick, the wounded, the cooks, and the clerks are all mobilized for the final effort. They are told to destroy their codes and burn their regimental flags to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. As the sun sets on July 6th, the northern tip of Saipan becomes a cauldron of seething desperation, where 4,000 souls prepare to unleash a wave of violence that will etch this night into the history books forever. The sun begins to dip below the horizon on July 6th, casting long, mournful shadows across the jagged northern cliffs of Saipan. Deep within a limestone cave known grimly as the 6th Company Command Post, the air is heavy with the suffocating humidity of the tropics and the stale, metallic scent of blood. General Yoshitsugu Saito, the commander of the Northern Marianas Defense, sits cross-legged on a woven mat, his body frail and trembling from days of starvation and illness. His once immaculate uniform is stained and hangs loosely on his emaciated frame, yet his eyes burn with a terrifying resolve. Around him, the flickering light of oil lamps dances on the damp walls, illuminating the faces of his remaining staff officers who stand in respectful, somber silence. This is the setting for the grim ceremony that will mark the end of organized resistance and the beginning of a slaughter. A makeshift meal, a final supper of canned crab meat and the last remaining bottles of sake, is laid out on a crate that serves as a low table. It is a surreal moment of civility amidst the apocalypse, a ritualistic farewell between men who know they will not live to see another sunset. Saito raises his cup with a shaking hand, toasting the Emperor and the spirits of the fallen. His voice raspy but firm. The officers drink deeply, savoring the burn of the alcohol which momentarily dulls the physical pain of their wounds and the crushing weight of their inevitable defeat. Sitting across from Saito is Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the man who once commanded the most powerful carrier strike force in history. It was Nagumo who unleashed the devastation on Pearl Harbor, a victory that seems a lifetime ago in this dark, dripping hole in the ground. Now, stripped of his ships and his glory, he is reduced to an infantry commander with no troops to lead. Trapped on a rock in the middle of an ocean the Americans now own, the tragedy of the Japanese Empire is written on his face, a mask of stoic resignation as he contemplates the long fall from the bridge of the times, Akagi times, to this desperate, forgotten cave. Following the meal, General Saito prepares his final order, a proclamation that will seal the fate of thousands. He dictates the message to a weary adjutant, his words choosing a path of honorable destruction over the shame of surrender. I am advancing to seek the enemy. The order reads, rejecting the passive defense that has characterized the campaign thus far. He invokes the ancient samurai code, calling upon every surviving soldier and civilian to sacrifice themselves in a final, glorious charge. 7 lives to repay the country. He commands, a spiritual directive demanding that each Japanese soul take 7 Americans with them before they expire. The order is not merely a tactical directive, it is a death warrant and a religious decree rolled into one. Runners are dispatched into the gathering darkness, carrying the written command to the scattered remnants of units hiding in the ravines and thickets of the Tanapag Plain. They move like shadows, slipping past American listening posts, delivering the message that the time for hiding is over. The times Gyokusai times, the shattering of the jewel is at hand. It is a call to total annihilation, a demand that the entire garrison shatter itself against the enemy rather than remain intact in disgrace. Back in the command cave, the time for the final ritual has arrived. It is approximately 10:00 p.m. when General Saito prepares to commit seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. Too weak from age and infirmity to perform the act with the traditional sword cut alone, he relies on his trusted adjutant to assist him. Saito faces north toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Bowing his head in a final act of reverence to Emperor Hirohito, he draws his own blood with a ceremonial blade, a symbolic gesture of purification, before his adjutant steps behind him with a pistol. A single, sharp crack echoes through the cavern, and the general slumps forward. His war ended. Moments later, Admiral Nagumo follows his counterpart into the void. The man who once held the fate of the Pacific in his hands ends his life with a pistol shot to the head, his body falling onto the dusty floor of the cave. Their deaths signal the severance of the head from the body of the army, leaving the thousands of troops outside without strategic leadership, but with a singular, fanatical purpose. The staff officers, having witnessed the departure of their commanders, begin the systematic destruction of classified documents and codebooks. They burn the regimental flags, the sacred symbols of their units, in small fires that fill the cave with acrid smoke, ensuring that no trophy falls into American hands. Outside the cave, The dissemination of Saito's final order triggers a macabre transformation among the surviving troops. In the gullies and foxholes, men who have been cowering from artillery fire suddenly find a strange, euphoric calm. They strip off their tattered shirts and wrap white hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, inscribing them with patriotic slogans or the names of their families. They drink the last drops of water or sake, sharing cigarettes in a quiet communion. The fear of death evaporates, replaced by a collective trance, a psychological state where the individual will is submerged into the surging tide of the group. The preparations for the attack reveal the utter desperation of the Japanese situation. There are not enough rifles for everyone, and ammunition is critically low, with many soldiers possessing only a single clip or a lone grenade. To arm the mass of humanity, men turn to primitive weapons that harken back to a feudal age. They sharpen bamboo poles into deadly spears, strap bayonets to long sticks, and gather piles of heavy rocks to use as bludgeons. Some wrap scythes or pickaxes in cloth to serve as makeshift swords. It is a pitiful arsenal against the machine guns and tanks of the US Army. But they do not intend to win a firefight. They intend to overwhelm with sheer biological mass. Perhaps the most harrowing aspect of the night is the mobilization of the wounded. Saito's order extends to everyone capable of movement, creating a legion of the damned known as the Bandage Brigade. Men with heavily bandaged heads, missing arms, or shattered legs struggle to their feet, helped by their comrades. Those who can hobble use sticks or rifles as crutches. Those who cannot walk are sometimes carried on the backs of the stronger soldiers. They emerge from the field hospitals, a ghastly procession of maimed warriors who refuse to be left behind, determined to die on their feet rather than in a sickbed. For those too incapacitated to move, the logic of the times Gyokusai times dictates a darker mercy. In the damp recesses of the overflow caves, medical officers and orderlies move among the stretcher-bound cases with a grim efficiency. They administer lethal injections or hand out grenades to those who still have the strength to pull the pin. Explosions muffle the groans of the dying as the caves are turned into sealed tombs. This self-inflicted culling removes the burden of the helpless, distilling the remaining force into a pure, concentrated instrument of death, unencumbered by the need to care for the infirm. Civilians, too, are swept up in the preparation for the final act. Men who have lost their families, construction workers, and local administrators join the ranks of the soldiers. They are given rudimentary instruction on how to use a spear or how to rush a tank with a satchel charge. Some are armed only with their bare hands and a burning hatred for the invaders. The line between combatant and non-combatant, already blurred throughout the campaign, is completely erased in these final hours. They are all children of the Emperor now, united in a pact of mutual destruction. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the soldiers of the US Army's 105th Infantry Regiment settle in for the night on the Tanapag Plain, largely unaware of the horror building in the darkness. Their commanders believe the Japanese are broken, a spent force capable only of scattered sniper fire or small-scale infiltration. The Americans dig shallow foxholes and set up tripwires, anticipating a quiet night before the final mop-up operations begin the next day. They heat their K-rations and talk of home, lulled into a false sense of security by the silence of the enemy guns. They do not realize that the silence is not one of surrender, but the deep intake of breath before a scream. As midnight passes and the early hours of July 7th arrive, the Japanese forces begin to assemble in a massive ravine that acts as a natural staging area. It is a congregation of ghosts. Thousands of men moving with disciplined silence, guided by the remaining officers waving swords in the moonlight. The smell of the gathering is intense, unwashed bodies, sickness, earth, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. They press together, shoulder to shoulder, a dense sea of humanity that stretches back for over a mile. The energy in the ravine is palpable, a vibrating tension that threatens to snap at any moment. There is no turning back now. The bridges have been burned, the leaders are dead, and the only way forward is into the mouths of the American guns. A low murmur begins to ripple through the crowd, a chanting of sutras and prayers that grows in intensity. They are waiting for the signal, the single moment when the dam will break and the floodwaters of their desperation will be unleashed. In the darkness of the ravine, 4 000 pairs of eyes look south, seeing nothing but the path to their own destruction. A path they will run with a terrifying joy. July 7th, 1944. 0400 hours. The darkness over the Tanapag Plain is thick and oppressive, concealing the nightmare that has gathered in the ravines. Along the perimeter of the U.S. 105th Infantry Regiment, weary sentries strain their eyes against the gloom, fighting the heavy eyelids of exhaustion. At first, the sound is nothing more than a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the heartbeat of the island itself rising from the earth. But the noise quickly swells, transforming into a cacophony of clattering metal, blowing bugles, and the terrifying, synchronized chanting of thousands of voices. A star shell pops overhead, bathing the landscape in a flickering, ghostly magnesium light, and reveals a sight that stops the breath of every American soldier on the line. Surging out of the darkness is a solid wall of humanity, a chaotic tide of 3,000 screaming souls moving as one singular organism. They come running through the tall grass and the scrub, a mixture of uniformed soldiers, bandaged cripples, and civilians, all sprinting directly toward the American foxholes. The air is instantly rent by the shrieking cry of Tenohaka Banzai. Long live the Emperor, repeated thousands of times until it becomes a deafening roar that drowns out the mechanical rattle of bolts being racked. It is not an infantry assault in any recognized military sense. It is a human avalanche, a tidal wave of flesh and bone driven by a desperate, suicidal fury that defies all logic or reason. The American machine gunners on the forward perimeter open fire immediately, their weapons chattering violently as they spray streams of tracers into the oncoming mass. The bullets tear through the front ranks, dropping men by the dozens. But the wave does not falter or slow down. For every Japanese soldier who falls, 2 more leap over his body, tramping the dead into the mud as they rush forward with fixed bayonets and drawn swords. The sheer density of the target is overwhelming. Gunners do not need to aim. They simply hold the triggers down, watching in horror as the tracers disappear into the wall of bodies without making a dent in the momentum of the charge. Deep within the attacking column, the bandage brigade limps and hobbles forward, presenting a gruesome spectacle that unnerves the defenders. Men with amputated arms, blinding head wounds, and gangrenous legs struggle to keep pace with their healthy comrades. Armed only with rocks or sharpened sticks, they are the living dead, soldiers who have risen from their deathbeds to participate in this final act of devotion. Their presence signals to the Americans that this is no tactical maneuver to seize ground. It is a total liquidation of the Japanese garrison. A collective suicide pact where the currency is blood, and the objective is simply to die while killing as many enemies as possible. The battle quickly degenerates into a savage, primeval brawl as the Japanese wave crashes physically into the American foxholes. The defensive line, designed to stop a conventional attack, is simply swamped by the weight of numbers. Rifles are used as clubs when magazines run dry, and men grapple in the dirt with knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. American soldiers are stabbed in their holes or pulled out and hacked to pieces by officers wielding samurai swords. The darkness is filled with the wet thud of blows, the screams of the dying, and the terrified shouts of men calling for medics who can no longer reach them. In the center of the mayhem, Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, becomes a beacon of desperate resistance. With his lines collapsing around him, O'Brien refuses to retreat, grabbing a pistol in each hand to fire at the swarming enemy. He moves among his men, shouting encouragement, rallying the crumbling defense even as he is wounded. When his ammunition runs out, he mounts a jeep and mans the .50 caliber machine gun, sweeping the tracers across the field until he is finally cut down by a mob of Japanese soldiers. His body is later found surrounded by dozens of enemy dead, a testament to the ferocity of his final stand. Nearby, Sergeant Thomas Baker, already grievously wounded from earlier fighting, refuses to be evacuated. Knowing it would slow down his withdrawing squad, he demands to be left behind, propped up against a tree with a loaded pistol and a final cigarette. In the chaos of the retreat, he becomes a lone island of resistance against the flood. When his body is discovered days later, the pistol is empty, and 8 dead Japanese soldiers lie sprawled around his position. These individual acts of heroism are flickerings of light in a black ocean of slaughter, delaying the enemy just enough to allow some Americans to escape the initial onslaught. The breakthrough is catastrophic. The Japanese punch a hole nearly 500 yards wide through the lines of the 105th Infantry. The American battalions are split and isolated, their communications wires cut, and their command posts overrun. The flood of attackers pours through the gap, not stopping to secure the breach but continuing to run headlong toward the rear areas. They are like water bursting through a dam, flowing uncontrollably toward the artillery emplacements and supply dumps that were thought to be safe behind the front lines. The distinction between the front and the rear evaporates instantly, plunging the entire sector into anarchy. Behind the infantry lines, the gunners of the 10th Marines Artillery Battalion suddenly find themselves acting as frontline infantry. Seeing the horde approaching, the artillerymen lower the barrels of their 105mm howitzers to point-blank range. They frantically cut the fuses on their shells to 0.4 of a second, creating muzzle bursts that detonate the moment the round leaves the cannon. The explosions shred the Japanese columns with shrapnel and concussion, turning men into mist. But the attackers are too close. The Marines eventually disable their guns by removing the firing pins and retreat to fight with carbines and fists. Engaging in hand-to-hand combat amidst the smoking howitzers, the chaos spreads to the beaches, where clerks, cooks, and headquarters personnel are hastily handed rifles and told to form a defensive line. The panic is palpable as rumors fly that the Japanese are pushing the Americans back into the sea. In the confusion, friendly fire incidents multiply, with terrified troops firing at anything that moves in the shadows. The majestic discipline of the U.S. military machine dissolves into a series of desperate, small-unit skirmishes where rank means nothing and survival is a matter of luck and brutality. The night air is so thick with smoke and dust that it chokes the lungs, adding physical suffocation to the psychological terror. For the Japanese soldiers, the charge is a euphoric release from weeks of suffering, a final ecstatic sprint towards oblivion. They do not seek cover, they do not use tactics, they simply run until they are shot. Some stop to commit suicide with grenades upon reaching the American positions, blowing themselves and their enemies to pieces in a final embrace. The officers, leading from the front with their ancestral swords, seek out American officers for duels, enacting a twisted fantasy of feudal warfare on a modern battlefield. It is a massacre of the Japanese army by its own hand, executed with the unwitting assistance of American firepower. As the pre-dawn light begins to bleed into the sky, the intensity of the attack finally begins to wane, not from a lack of will, but from a lack of living men. The Tanapag Plain is carpeted with bodies, a gruesome mosaic where the dead are piled 3 or 4 deep in places. The sound of the battle shifts from a continuous roar to sporadic bursts of gunfire as the surviving Americans begin to hunt down the stragglers. The momentum of the Banzai charge has spent itself against the steel wall of the American military, but the cost has been exorbitant. The 105th Infantry has been effectively destroyed as a fighting unit, its companies decimated, and its leadership dead or wounded. The scene that reveals itself with the rising sun is one of apocalyptic destruction. The tall grass has been trampled flat or burned away, revealing soil that is slick with blood. Weapons, helmets, and personal effects are scattered everywhere, the detritus of 2 armies mixed together in death. American tanks, which had moved up to plug the gaps, sit silent, their treads clogged with gore, their crews exhausted and shell-shocked inside the steel hulls. The smell of the battlefield, a combination of cordite, raw meat, and tropical rot, rises with the heat of the day, a stench that will cling to the survivors for the rest of their lives. Survivors of the 105th Infantry, dazed and covered in the blood of friends and enemies, emerge from the tree line or wade in from the reef where they had been forced to retreat. They look out over the field of slaughter with hollow eyes, unable to comprehend the scale of what they have just survived. They have witnessed the death throes of the Imperial Japanese Army, a spectacle of horror that transcends their understanding of warfare. The enemy has not just been defeated, they have annihilated themselves in a tidal wave of violence that has washed away the last organized resistance on the island. The silence that settles over Saipan on the morning of July 7th is heavy and unnatural, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of burning vegetation. The great Banzai charge is over, leaving behind a scar on the land and the soul of every man who witnessed it. The Americans have held the line, but the victory feels hollow amidst the carnage. As the medics begin the grim task of sorting the living from the dead, the reality sets in. The battle for Saipan is effectively won, but the cleanup of this human tragedy will be a descent into a new kind of hell. The sun rises over the Tanapag Plain on the morning of July 8th, illuminating a tableau of horror that defies human comprehension. The golden light of dawn reveals a landscape that has been transformed into a charnel house, where the earth is barely visible beneath a carpet of corpses. Over 4,000 Japanese bodies lie twisted and piled in heaps, intertwined with the fallen Americans of the 105th Infantry, creating a grotesque mosaic of olive, drab, and khaki. The silence that hangs over the field is heavy and unnatural, broken only by the buzzing of millions of flies that have already begun to feast on the dead. It is a scene of absolute finality, a visual testament to the destructive power of a culture that preferred total extinction to the shame of surrender. American survivors emerge from their foxholes and defensive positions, their faces masks of soot and dried blood, moving like sleepwalkers through the carnage. They stare with hollow eyes at the human wreckage, unable to process the scale of the slaughter that occurred in the darkness. Many soldiers vomit or simply sit down in the dirt and weep, their minds shattered by the intensity of the close-quarters combat. The distinct smell of the battlefield, a suffocating mixture of rotting flesh, cordite, excrement, and coagulated blood, rises with the heat of the tropical morning, assaulting the senses and making the simple act of breathing a struggle against nausea. The toll on the U.S. 105th Infantry Regiment is catastrophic, with nearly 1,000 men killed or wounded in the span of a few furious hours. Medical teams move somberly among the piles, checking for pulses and tagging the dead, their white armbands stained red from the sheer volume of casualties. Bodies of American GIs are found surrounded by mounds of enemy dead, evidence of the ferocious last stands made by isolated squads cut off in the night. The regiment has effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit, its ranks decimated and its command structure shattered, requiring immediate relief by fresh troops who look upon the survivors with a mixture of pity and awe. As the shock wears off, the grim business of mopping up begins with a cold. Mechanical efficiency. Sherman tanks from the supporting armor battalions rumble forward, their tracks crunching sickeningly over the debris of war that litters the plain. Infantrymen walk warily behind the steel monsters, rifles raised, firing into the piles of bodies to ensure that no feigning survivors remain to hurl a final grenade. The Japanese stragglers, wounded and dazed, are hunted down in the tall grass and ravines, often engaging in brief, suicidal firefights that end only when they are blasted into silence by tank cannons or flamethrowers. Throughout the day, the sounds of isolated gunshots echo across the plain as Japanese soldiers choose to end their own lives rather than face capture. American patrols watch in horror as enemy soldiers, missing limbs or blinded by wounds, clutch hand grenades to their chests and pull the pins. This continued self-destruction reinforces the alien nature of the enemy to the GIs, who cannot bridge the cultural gap that demands such absolute sacrifice. Interpreters with megaphones call out to the survivors, promising water and medical treatment, but their pleas are largely ignored, answered only by the crack of a Nambu pistol or the dull thud of an explosion. The sheer volume of the dead presents an immediate sanitary crisis, forcing the engineers to bring in bulldozers to manage the aftermath. In a scene that will haunt the operators for the rest of their lives, the heavy machines push mounds of Japanese bodies into hastily dug mass graves. The drivers tie bandanas soaked in gasoline around their faces to ward off the stench, their eyes fixed straight ahead to avoid looking at the faces of the men they are burying. It is a gruesome, industrial solution to a human tragedy, a necessary act to prevent the spread of disease in the sweltering tropical heat that accelerates decomposition. Out at sea, the sailors aboard the U.S. Navy ships patrolling the coast witness the overflow of the massacre drifting on the tides. The turquoise waters of the lagoon are stained with streaks of red, and bodies of Japanese soldiers bob in the surf, washing up against the coral reefs. Sharks are drawn to the feeding frenzy, thrashing in the water, adding a primal layer of horror to the maritime scene. Patrol boats maneuver through the floating graveyard, their crews silent and grim, witnessing the physical cost of the island campaign washing out to meet them in the endless Pacific. Amidst the carnage, a darker side of human nature emerges as some American troops begin to scour the field for souvenirs. Japanese flags, samurai swords, and lugers are prized trophies, pulled from the grip of stiffening corpses to be traded or sent home. In the most macabre instances, soldiers check the mouths of the dead for gold teeth, a brutal practice born from the dehumanization of a savage war. Officers try to curb the looting, but the chaos of the battlefield and the hardened emotions of the men make it difficult to enforce discipline in the midst of such overwhelming death. Despite the horror, the aftermath of the Banzai charge signals the definitive end of organized Japanese resistance on Saipan. General Saito is dead. Admiral Nagumo is dead, and the main strength of the garrison has been expended in one final, futile gesture. The American commanders, looking over the map of the island, realize that the securement of Saipan is now a matter of time and cleanup rather than major combat. The road to the northern cliffs is open, but the price paid for this victory has been etched into the psyche of the division, a trauma that victory parades will never fully erase. A handful of Japanese soldiers do fall into American hands, mostly those too weak from wounds or starvation to kill themselves. They are dragged from the piles of dead, emaciated and trembling, expecting to be tortured and killed as their propaganda had warned. Instead, they are given water and cigarettes by wary American guards, their eyes wide with confusion at this unexpected mercy. These prisoners, few in number, are the only living remnants of the force that charged the night before, ghosts who have inadvertently survived their own funeral to become outcasts of their own culture. As the American lines advance past the slaughterhouse of Tanapag, they push the remaining civilian population further north toward Marpi Point. These refugees, having witnessed the destruction of their defenders, are gripped by a renewed panic, convinced that the American devils will now turn their fury upon the non-combatants. They move along the cliff edges, a terrified flock herded toward the precipice, their fear fueled by the terrifying sounds of the mop-up operations behind them. The destruction of the army has removed the barrier between the civilians and the invaders, setting the stage for the final, tragic act of the Saipan drama. Marine General Holland Smith tours the battlefield later in the day, his jeep driving slowly through the corridors cleared by the bulldozers. Even for a veteran of the Great War and the Pacific campaigns, the density of the dead is shocking to the man known as Howling Mad. He observes the tactical futility of the charge, noting that while it inflicted damage, it achieved nothing of strategic value for the Japanese. It reinforces his belief in the fanatical nature of the enemy, confirming that the road to Tokyo will be paved with the total annihilation of the opposing forces rather than their capitulation. By the evening of July 8th, the Tanapag Plain has been largely secured, though the stench of death remains overpowering. Fresh American units move through the ravaged area, stepping past the freshly filled mass graves as they prepare to assault the final northern tip of the island. The mood is not one of triumph but of grim determination to finish the job and leave this cursed rock. The soldiers check their weapons and look toward the cliffs of Marpi Point, where the last tragedy of Saipan is waiting to unfold, sensing that the horror is not quite over, as the sun sets once again, casting long purple shadows over the Pacific. The focus of the battle shifts to the civilian tragedy looming on the cliffs. The guns have fallen silent on the plain, replaced by the eerie sound of wind whistling through the cane and the crashing of waves against the rocks below. The soldiers resting for the night can hear the faint cries of women and children carried on the breeze, a haunting prelude to the mass suicides that will shock the world and define the legacy of Saipan forever. July 9th, 1944. The battle for Saipan has officially reached the northernmost tip of the island, a place of stark, terrifying beauty known as Marpi Point. Here, the land rises abruptly into a plateau before dropping hundreds of feet into the churning Pacific Ocean below. The jagged limestone cliffs stand like silent sentinels against the blue sky, witnessing the final, tragic act of a campaign that has already claimed tens of thousands of lives. The roar of artillery has faded, replaced by the crashing of waves and the crying of the wind, setting the stage for a humanitarian horror that will scar the memories of every American soldier who stands witness on the precipice. Huddled on the plateau and hiding in the caves along the cliff face are thousands of Japanese civilians, the last remnants of the colonial population. They are a wretched collection of women, children, and the elderly, their clothes torn and their bodies emaciated from weeks of hiding without food or water. Fear has driven them to this edge of the world. A fear carefully cultivated by years of propaganda that painted the Americans as sadistic monsters. They have been told that the invaders will torture their men, rape their women, and devour their children. A lie that has taken root in their minds with the strength of religious dogma, making the deadly drop before them seem like a mercy. As the American troops advance slowly, weapons lowered, they are accompanied by Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans, fighting for the US who use loudspeakers to project their voices across the gap. They plead with the civilians to come forward, promising food, water, and safety, desperately trying to bridge the chasm of mistrust. "Do not jump," they shout in Japanese, their voices cracking with emotion as they see the families edging closer to the abyss. American soldiers hold out cans of rations and canteens, waving them in the air to show their benign intentions, praying that the universal language of survival will override the indoctrination of death. For a few, the pleas work, and small groups of civilians hesitantly emerge from the brush, hands raised, weeping as they are given water by the Marines they feared. But for the vast majority, the psychological conditioning is too deep, and the presence of the enemy only triggers the final panic. On the lip of the cliffs, a collective hysteria takes hold, a contagion of suicide that sweeps through the crowd like a wildfire. Fathers hug their families one last time before pushing them over the edge. Mothers clutch their infants to their chests and leap into the void without looking back. It is a scene of mass self-destruction that defies all instinct for self-preservation. Two distinct locations become the focal points of this tragedy, places that will forever be known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. At Suicide Cliff, the drop is onto jagged rocks at the base of the plateau, a fall that leaves bodies broken and twisted in the ravines. At Banzai Cliff, the drop is directly into the ocean, where the surf churns white against the coral. Entire families line up on the edge, bowing to the east toward the Imperial Palace, before stepping off into the air. The sight of women in colorful kimonos fluttering like broken butterflies as they fall is an image that burns itself into the retinas of the helpless onlookers. Down in the water, US Navy patrol craft and destroyers maneuver dangerously close to the reefs, their crews armed with boat hooks and nets in a desperate rescue mission. Sailors dive into the blood-stained water to pull survivors from the surf, often retrieving only bodies or finding themselves fighting with civilians who try to drown themselves even after being rescued. The sound of bodies hitting the water and the rocks echoes like gunshots, a rhythmic percussion of death that continues for hours. The sea turns a sickening shade of pink, and the bobbing corpses clog the propellers of the rescue boats, forcing the captains to reverse engines to clear the gruesome obstructions. The American soldiers on the cliffs are reduced to spectators of a nightmare, their toughness stripped away by the sheer pity and horror of the spectacle. Hardened Marines, who had stormed beaches and cleared caves with flamethrowers, turn away in tears, unable to watch mothers throwing their babies onto the rocks below. Some shout in anger, cursing the Japanese government for poisoning the minds of its people. Others simply stare in shock, their rifles hanging uselessly at their sides. The victory they have fought so hard to achieve feels hollow, tainted by the senseless waste of innocent life that spills over the edge of Marpi Point. By the time the sun sets, the cliffs are silent, save for the crying of the few survivors who were physically restrained from jumping. The final count of civilian suicides is estimated in the thousands, a demographic catastrophe that wipes out entire bloodlines. The tragedy at Marpi Point serves as a grim foreshadowing of what awaits the Allies on the Japanese home islands. It demonstrates that the Japanese population is prepared to choose national suicide over surrender, a realization that sends a chill through the Pentagon and influences the decision-making process regarding the use of the atomic bomb a year later. The fall of Saipan sends a seismic shockwave through the political foundations of Tokyo, cracking the facade of invincibility that the military government has maintained. The loss of the island breaches the absolute national defense zone, meaning that the American bombers are now within striking range of the capital. The news is so devastating that it can no longer be hidden from the public or the emperor. On July 18, 1944, just days after the island is declared secure, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire war cabinet are forced to resign in disgrace. The architect of the war has fallen, brought down not by a coup, but by the loss of a small island thousands of miles away. With the fighting over, the character of Saipan changes overnight from a battlefield to a massive construction site. The U.S. Navy Seabees arrive with their bulldozers and dynamite, leveling the cane fields and filling the craters to build Isley Field. The transformation is industrial and rapid, turning the island into the world's largest unsinkable aircraft carrier. The coral that was once stained with the blood of Marines is now paved over with asphalt, creating runways long enough to launch the newest and most terrifying weapon in the American arsenal, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The arrival of the B-29 seconds in October 1944 marks the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. These silver giants, gleaming in the tropical sun, line the runways of Saipan, their pressurized cabins and massive bomb loads representing the pinnacle of aerial warfare. The pilots and crews who walk the tarmac look out at the nearby jungle, knowing that the ground beneath their feet was purchased at a cost of over 3,000 American dead and 13,000 wounded. They understand that their mission is the direct dividend of that sacrifice, and they carry the weight of that obligation every time they climb into their cockpits. On November 24, 1944, the engines of over 100 B-29 seconds roar to life, shaking the ground that had so recently trembled from artillery fire. The first mass raid on Tokyo, led by the legendary Times Dauntless Dottie *, begins its takeoff roll down the crushed coral runway of Isley Field. The bombers lift off heavily, their wings dipping low over the cliffs of Marpy Point, casting fleeting shadows over the graves of the civilians who died there. They turn north, climbing into the thin air, carrying fire to the heart of the enemy nation that started the war. The flight to Tokyo takes hours, a long haul over the vast, empty Pacific. But for the Japanese capital, the threat is now immediate and existential. When the bombs begin to fall on the Nakajima Aircraft Company and the wooden neighborhoods of Tokyo, it brings the reality of the war home to the Japanese people for the first time since the Doolittle raid. The capture of Saipan has kicked the door to Japan wide open, allowing the Americans to rain destruction down with impunity. The fires that burn in Tokyo are kindled by the sparks struck on the rocky ridges of Mount Tapashao and the bloody sands of the invasion beaches. For the soldiers who survived the battle, Saipan remains a memory of contrasting extremes: the turquoise beauty of the lagoon and the rotting stench of the dead, the heroism of their comrades and the fanaticism of the enemy. They leave the island to prepare for the next invasions: Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, but they leave a part of themselves behind in the limestone caves. The island becomes a vast cemetery, a silent monument to the ferocity of the Pacific War. The wind that blows through the sugarcane continues to whisper the stories of the Banzai charge and the cliffs, a requiem for the thousands of souls who vanished into the history of this small, violent rock. Ultimately, the Battle of Saipan stands as the decisive turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when the inevitable defeat of Japan became a mathematical certainty. It destroyed the illusion of Japanese impregnability, shattered their government, and provided the platform for the final aerial assault. But beyond the strategic victory lies the human tragedy, a narrative of courage, desperation, and horror that transcends the maps and the casualty lists. It remains a testament to the terrible price of total war, where the line between soldier and civilian is erased, and where victory is measured not in miles gained, but in the sheer capacity to endure the unendurable.